Part 1. The Strategic Foundation. The Eastern Front during World War II became the deadliest theater of conflict in human history, not only through direct combat, but through a deliberate strategy of deprivation that would claim millions of lives. The scale of destruction on this front dwarfed even the Western European campaigns. Entire armies were annihilated, cities were reduced to rubble, and the civilian population endured suffering that challenged the imagination. Yet beneath the immediate violence lay a calculated plan far more systematic than the chaos of conventional warfare. This section establishes how Nazi Germany developed and implemented a deliberate strategy to use starvation as a weapon of conquest, examining the ideological foundations, strategic calculations, and administrative machinery that transformed hunger into an instrument of state policy. The logistical crisis and ideological solution. When German forces launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, they initiated an invasion of unprecedented scale. Millions of soldiers advanced across vast distances into Soviet territory, creating supply challenges that conventional military logistics seemed incapable of solving. The traditional model of warfare, where supply lines stretched from the homeland through conquered territory to forward positions, would have required an immense logistical network. Germany simply did not possess the transportation capacity, the industrial production, or the raw material reserves to sustain such an operation through conventional means. The distances involved were enormous. From the German border to Moscow exceeded 1,000 kilometers. From the border to the oil fields of the Caucasus stretched even further. Motor vehicles, fuel, and rail capacity were finite resources in a nation already stretched to supply warfare on multiple fronts. However, rather than constraining German strategy, this logistical crisis became the catalyst for a radical transformation in how the war would be waged. Nazi leadership, and particularly Adolf Hitler, rejected the idea of a supply-dependent campaign in favor of what they termed a strategy of living off the land. The army would not depend on supplies shipped from Germany. Instead, it would extract the resources it needed from the conquered territories themselves. This doctrine was captured in explicit planning documents. The Wehrmacht would requisition food, livestock, raw materials, and labor from Soviet lands, leaving behind whatever surplus remained, which Nazi planners calculated would be minimal. What distinguished this approach from the ordinary requisitioning that accompanied military occupation was its ideological dimension. The Nazi regime did not view the Soviet Union as a nation to be conquered, governed, and integrated into an expanded German state. Rather, it represented territory to be cleansed, emptied of its current population, and colonized by German settlers. The Soviet people, viewed through the lens of Nazi racial ideology, were not conquered subjects to be managed, but obstacles to be removed. Starvation was not merely an unfortunate side effect of military requisitioning or the result of supply chain disruption. It was an intended policy, a mechanism through which the conquest would be achieved and the territory prepared for German settlement. The planning and prediction of mass death. The systematic nature of this strategy becomes evident when examining the planning documents and economic calculations that preceded the invasion. German government ministries, particularly the Reich Ministry for Food and Agriculture and the economic agencies attached to the military command structure, produced detailed memoranda analyzing how many Soviets would die under occupation. These were not casual projections or vague estimates, but precise calculations based on assumptions about food availability, requisition rates, and civilian nutritional requirements. The most damning of these documents came from the Reich Ministry for Food and Agriculture. Internal memoranda stated explicitly that feeding the German population during a prolonged Eastern campaign would require the systematic extraction of food from Soviet territories, and that this extraction would necessarily result in mass starvation among the Soviet civilian population. One particularly stark memo noted that many tens of millions of people in this territory will become superfluous and will die or have to emigrate to Siberia. This was not speculation about potential outcomes, but a planned consequence of the occupation strategy. The Wehrmacht's administration also produced economic analyses showing how different occupation policies would impact food availability and survival rates. These calculations were embedded in operational orders and administrative directives sent down through the military hierarchy. Officers in the field were thus not operating without information about the likely consequences of their requisition policies. They knew, or could reasonably infer from the calculations and directives they received, that their extraction quotas would produce famine conditions among the civilian population. The classification of populations and differential rations. The starvation strategy was not applied uniformly across all populations under German control. Instead, Nazi authorities created a complex hierarchical system in which different groups received different rations based explicitly on racial and ideological classifications. This system transformed the logistics of food distribution into an instrument of racial policy, making starvation not accidental but proportional to perceived racial status. German civilians and soldiers received the highest rations and were prioritized in all food allocations. The German Army's supply system, despite the supposed doctrine of living off the land, maintained dedicated supply lines, ensuring that German troops and the home population would not suffer deprivation. Agricultural production in the Reich itself was protected, and extraction from occupied territories was calculated to supplement and enhance German living standards rather than replace disrupted domestic production. Ethnic Germans living in Soviet territories, citizens of Allied nations, and Western European populations received rations calculated to maintain their survival and working capacity. These rations were inadequate by normal nutritional standards, but sufficient to prevent immediate starvation. Below this tier lay the Slavic population, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and other Soviet peoples who received significantly reduced rations. The calculations were explicit. These populations would be permitted to survive at subsistence levels, sufficient only to continue working under German direction, with the understanding that gradual attrition would reduce their numbers over time. At the bottom of this hierarchy were Soviet prisoners of war and the Jewish population confined in ghettos and camps. For these groups, German authorities calculated rations designed to ensure death within a defined time frame. Soviet prisoners of war received rations acknowledged by German officers to be incompatible with survival. One Wehrmacht quartermaster's report noted that Soviet POWs were being deliberately provided with insufficient food because they were considered expendable, and their elimination would reduce supply burdens. Similar calculations drove the starvation rations in the ghettos, where populations were confined with the explicit intention that hunger, along with disease and harsh conditions, would eliminate them. The infrastructure of extraction. The transformation of German-occupied Soviet territory into an extraction zone required the development of comprehensive administrative and logistical infrastructure. This apparatus was designed not merely to requisition surplus food, but to extract maximum resources regardless of the impact on civilian survival. Agricultural committees were established in every occupied region, tasked with identifying and collecting food stocks. Railways, trucks, and shipping vessels were systematically dedicated to moving food westward toward Germany and areas under German occupation. The requisition system operated through fixed quotas that bore little relationship to actual local food production. Occupied territories were designated as surplus areas and assigned quotas for grain delivery, livestock requisition, and dairy product collection. These quotas were often set at levels exceeding the actual food available in a region, forcing authorities to extract seed grain meant for spring planting and reserves maintained for survival during winter. As one German official's report from Ukraine acknowledged, the requisition quota for a particular district exceeded the total grain production in that district by more than 50%. The agricultural cycle itself was disrupted by German policy. Young men and horses were conscripted for military use or transport, leaving insufficient labor for harvesting and cultivation. Tractors and machinery were seized. Fertilizer, normally imported or produced domestically, became unavailable. Livestock herds, reduced by requisitions and unsuitable conditions, could not be replaced. The productive capacity of Soviet agriculture was deliberately undermined through policies that prioritized extraction over sustainability. Transport infrastructure that might have distributed available food within occupied territories was instead reserved for military supply lines and extraction operations. The railways, which Soviet authorities had used to move grain between regions and prevent localized famines, were now controlled by German military authorities and dedicated almost exclusively to strategic supply operations. The effect was to prevent any redistribution of remaining food stocks to regions experiencing the most severe shortages, ensuring that local famines would develop and persist without relief. The ideological and strategic coherence. What emerges from examination of Nazi planning and policy is not a chaotic or unintended process, but a coherent strategy in which logistics, ideology, and military objectives converged. The starvation of Soviet populations was not merely acceptable as a side effect of military operations, it was integral to the strategic vision. The conquest of Soviet territory was conceived not as the subjugation of an enemy nation, but as the acquisition of space for German settlement and the elimination of populations deemed racially and ideologically incompatible with the Nazi vision of a racially purified European order. This strategic conception meant that military success and the implementation of starvation policy were mutually reinforcing. A rapid military victory would reduce the time over which occupation authorities needed to feed the civilian population. The systematic extraction of food would deny resources to the Red Army and support the German war effort. The reduction of the Soviet population through starvation would open territory for German settlement and eliminate the human obstacle to this colonization scheme. In this vision, starvation was not a regrettable necessity, but a means toward multiple ends simultaneously. The planning documents, the hierarchical ration system, the requisition quotas, and the infrastructure of extraction all testify to the intentional nature of this starvation strategy. This was not the improvisation of a military campaign struggling with unexpected logistical challenges. It was a calculated policy, developed in advance, documented in official memoranda, implemented through administrative structures, and pursued with systematic precision. The scale and scope of suffering that would result was not merely foreseeable but was explicitly predicted and planned for in the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Part 2. The Machinery of Deprivation. The transformation of starvation policy from strategic doctrine into mass death required the development of complex operational systems. These were not improvised responses to crisis conditions, but deliberately constructed machinery designed to maximize food extraction and minimize civilian survival. The second section examines this apparatus in detail. The administrative structures that managed occupation territories, the transportation networks that were weaponized to prevent food distribution, the camps and enclosed zones where starvation became systematic, and the bureaucratic mechanisms through which calculated mass death was routinized and implemented. Administrative structures and extraction quotas. German occupation of Soviet territory created unprecedented administrative challenges. Vast areas had to be governed, resources extracted, and populations controlled, all while maintaining sufficient order for military operations to proceed. The solution was a multi-layered bureaucracy that extended from Berlin through regional commands to the smallest towns and villages under German control. This administrative structure was systematized specifically to maximize extraction and minimize moral or practical obstacles to the requisition of food. At the highest level, the civilian and military authorities in Berlin set overall extraction targets based on German food requirements and military supply needs. These targets were transmitted to regional military commands, which translated them into specific quotas for each district and village under their control. The quotas were calculated not based on actual food availability, but on what German authorities desired to extract. A region was assigned a grain quota, a livestock quota, a dairy product quota, and quotas for other food items without regard for whether the region produced sufficient food to meet these demands and still sustain its population. The implementation of these quotas fell to local German occupation authorities and the collaborating Ukrainian, Russian, and other Soviet administrators who worked under German supervision. These local officials faced explicit pressure to meet their assigned quotas regardless of local conditions. Failure to achieve requisition targets resulted in punishment, including dismissal, imprisonment, or assignment to dangerous military duties. This created a cascading pressure system in which each level of authority transmitted the quotas downward while accepting the threat of punishment for non-compliance. No official could claim that starvation conditions rendered the quota impossible. The quota remained the paramount directive, and starvation was simply the predicted consequence of successful quota fulfillment. The consequences of this system emerged rapidly as occupation proceeded. In regions designated as surplus areas, requisition officers seized not only surplus grain, but seed grain meant for spring planting. They confiscated livestock herds required for agricultural work and food production. They extracted dietary supplements, sugar, oil, honey, that provided necessary calories and nutrients. In some regions, requisition teams removed entire harvests, leaving nothing for the local population. Residents were permitted to keep only what German authorities judged sufficient for bare survival, a calculation that proved to be significantly lower than the actual caloric requirements for human survival, particularly for populations engaged in heavy labor. The weaponization of transportation infrastructure. Transportation networks became a critical mechanism through which the starvation strategy was implemented. The railways, roads, and waterways that under normal conditions distributed food throughout a territory were instead repurposed to extract resources and prevent distribution. This transformation occurred at every level of the system, from strategic decisions about how to allocate rail capacity to tactical decisions about which roads would be used for military supply and which would be left impassable. The Soviet railway system, built during earlier decades and expanded in the 1930s, had connected the major population centers and agricultural regions. Under Soviet control, this network had functioned to move grain from surplus regions to deficit areas, preventing localized famines and ensuring that the entire population could be fed from the aggregate food production of the entire nation. The Germans systematically repurposed this system. Rail lines that had run primarily north-south, connecting agricultural southern regions to population centers in the north, were redirected or rerouted to run east-west, facilitating German military supply operations and the extraction of resources westward toward Germany. The capacity of the railway system became the critical constraint. A limited number of trains and locomotives operated under German control. These limited resources were allocated according to military priorities. Supply trains carrying ammunition, fuel, weapons, and other military equipment took absolute precedence. Behind these came trains transporting extracted resources, grain, livestock, industrial products, toward Germany. At the bottom of the priority structure were civilian transport needs. Trains that might have distributed food within occupied territories to prevent regional famines were simply not available. The administrative structure that might have coordinated such distribution ceased to exist, having been destroyed in the invasion or dismantled by occupation authorities. Motor vehicles faced similar constraints. The German army, despite possessing significant motorized transport capacity, could not spare vehicles for civilian food distribution. Trucks were needed for military supply, for transporting troops, for moving equipment. The consequence was that occupied territories, even those with adequate aggregate food production, could develop severe regional shortages because the distribution infrastructure had been dismantled or appropriated for military use. Road networks deteriorated rapidly. Soviet forces in retreat had destroyed bridges, culverts, and road surfaces to impede German advancement. German authorities, focused on maintaining supply routes for military operations, did not repair secondary roads that served civilian food distribution. Villages and rural areas without direct access to the main supply routes became increasingly isolated, unable to receive goods through trade or redistribution. The informal trade networks that had historically connected rural and urban areas, and that would have allowed food to flow toward regions experiencing acute shortages, collapsed under the weight of occupation. Camps as zones of intensified starvation. The starvation strategy operated differentially across the occupied territory, with certain categories of population experiencing far more severe deprivation. Soviet prisoners of war and populations confined in ghettos became zones of maximal starvation, where the rations provided were calculated explicitly to ensure death within defined periods. Soviet prisoners of war, numbering in the millions as the German army advanced and captured vast numbers of Red Army soldiers, presented a particular problem for occupation authorities. Large concentrations of prisoners could not be transported to the rear immediately, nor could they be released or assimilated into occupied territories. The solution was to confine them in camps with minimal facilities and inadequate food. The rations provided to Soviet POWs were set at levels that German officers openly acknowledged were incompatible with survival. A quartermaster's report noted that Soviet prisoners would be maintained at starvation rations because they were considered racially inferior, and their death would reduce the burden on German supply lines. Another officer's account stated that prisoners were provided with bread and thin soup. A total caloric intake of perhaps 600 to 800 calories per day, insufficient for survival for any extended period. The camps themselves became death zones. Prisoners were housed in open areas or inadequate structures lacking protection from winter weather. Medical facilities were non-existent. Sanitation was primitive. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, and other diseases spread rapidly through the confined populations. The combination of starvation, disease, and exposure produced mortality rates that climbed toward 10% per month in the most severely deprived camps. Entire camps, initially holding tens of thousands of prisoners, were reduced to a few thousand survivors within months. Jewish populations confined in ghettos and occupied territories experienced similar starvation regimes. The Warsaw Ghetto, the Lodz Ghetto, and smaller ghettos throughout occupied Soviet and Polish territories were established ostensibly as administrative arrangements, but functioned as starvation camps. Populations were confined within defined areas, separated from surrounding populations, and provided with rations calculated to ensure gradual death. The rations in the Warsaw Ghetto, for instance, provided approximately 200 calories per day in the ghetto's early period, but dropped below 800 calories as occupation proceeded. Food prices in the black markets that emerged within ghettos climbed to levels completely unaffordable to most confined populations. Smuggling of food into the ghettos, which allowed survival for some, was subject to German interdiction and punishment. Bureaucratic language and distancing mechanisms. The systematic nature of the starvation strategy was obscured through bureaucratic language and administrative mechanisms that distanced decision-makers from the consequences of their choices. Orders were phrased in technical language emphasizing logistics and supply management rather than the death they would produce. Reports focused on quotas achieved and supplies extracted rather than on starvation conditions or mortality rates. Administrative structures were compartmentalized so that no single official bore responsibility for the entire system. Each was responsible only for their specific function within the larger apparatus. Supply requisition reports emphasized successful collection of grain, livestock, and other resources, describing the operation as efficient resource management. The fact that requisitions exceeded local food production and had rendered the civilian population unable to feed itself was subordinate to the primary objective of extraction. Administrators could report that they had fulfilled their quotas and kept their soldiers supplied, without explicitly addressing the starvation conditions that resulted from their requisitions. Military supply officers could calculate that their supply lines were functioning efficiently, that troops were receiving adequate rations, and that extraction operations were supporting the war effort. The fact that these supply lines were being fed through food extracted from a starving civilian population was simply the mathematics of occupation warfare. The documentation showed that the supply system was working. It did not emphasize the underlying human cost. This bureaucratic distancing created moral and psychological space for officials at every level to participate in the system, while maintaining a form of plausible deniability regarding its human consequences. Officers could claim that they were simply executing orders and performing their military duties. Administrators could claim that they were implementing requisition policies established at higher levels. The compartmentalized structure meant that those making overall policy decisions at the highest levels could distance themselves from the specific operations through which their policies were implemented. The collapse of civilian food markets and survival. As German requisitioning stripped territories of food, civilian food markets deteriorated and then collapsed entirely. In normal circumstances, food moves through multiple channels: direct farmer to consumer sales, local markets, regional trade networks, and larger commercial distribution systems. Under German occupation, these channels were systematically disrupted. Food that might have been available for civilian purchase was instead requisitioned. Prices climbed as supplies disappeared. By late 1941 and into 1942, in severely occupied territories, civilian access to food through normal markets had virtually ceased. Black markets emerged, but offered only limited relief. Goods in black markets were scarce, prices were astronomical, and the population had minimal resources with which to purchase anything. A loaf of bread that might normally have cost a few kopecks climbed to prices that exceeded a week's wages. Meat disappeared entirely from civilian availability, except through smuggling and theft. Vegetables, fruits, and other dietary supplements became luxuries utterly beyond reach for the vast majority of the population. Families surviving in occupied territories increasingly depended on whatever they could grow in small gardens or allotments, on whatever game they could hunt illegally, or on whatever items they could produce and trade. However, German authorities, recognizing that private gardens and foraging could supplement official rations, sometimes restricted civilian access to land or attempted to control what could be grown. The autonomy required to feed oneself through gardening or small-scale production was deliberately constrained by occupation authorities to maximize dependence on official rations, which were themselves set below nutritional requirements. The documentation of intent. Perhaps the most damning aspect of the starvation machinery was the extent to which it was documented. The orders, reports, calculations, and correspondence that flowed through the occupation administration created a comprehensive record of deliberate, planned starvation. Officers reported not on the unfortunate side effects of military occupation, but on the successful implementation of food extraction policies. Administrators calculated not merely the logistics of supply, but the predictable consequences, mass death, that would result from their policies. This documentation would, in the post-war period, provide irrefutable evidence that the starvation of Soviet populations was not the unfortunate outcome of military necessity, but the intended and systematically pursued objective of occupation policy. Part 3. The Cost and Reckoning. The consequences of the starvation strategy extended far beyond the immediate death toll, though that toll itself was catastrophic in scale. The deliberate deprivation of Soviet populations shaped the trajectory of the war itself, transformed the psychological orientation of Soviet combat forces, and left demographic and medical scars that persisted for generations after the conflict's conclusion. This final section quantifies the human cost of the starvation policy, examines how it ultimately undermined Germany's strategic objectives, traces the long-term medical and demographic consequences for populations that survived, and considers how this history was documented and understood in the post-war period. The quantification of mass death. Estimating the precise number of deaths resulting from starvation and starvation-related causes during the German occupation of Soviet territory confronts the historian with incomplete records, conflicting estimates, and the sheer difficulty of accounting for millions of deaths scattered across vast territories over multiple years. Nevertheless, the scale of mortality is undeniable and staggering in magnitude. Soviet prisoners of war held in German captivity experienced the highest documented mortality rates. Estimates vary, but the consensus among historians places the number of Soviet POW deaths in German camps between 4.2 and 5.8 million out of approximately 5.7 million captured. The vast majority of these deaths resulted from starvation, exposure, and disease rather than combat or execution. The mortality rate was not uniform across the war's duration. It was highest in the first winter of 1941-1942, when starvation rations, inadequate shelter, and brutal conditions combined to produce death rates approaching 15 to 20% per month in the most severely affected camps. German officers responsible for these camps documented the deliberate nature of the starvation, with one quartermaster noting in reports that Soviet prisoners were not expected to survive the winter because maintaining them through captivity was deemed economically wasteful. Civilian deaths from starvation in occupied Soviet territories reached into the millions, though precise numbers remain impossible to establish. The siege of Leningrad alone, where blockade combined with German requisition policies and limited supply lines produced starvation conditions, killed approximately 1 million people, roughly 1/3 to 1/4 of the city's pre-war population. The majority died from hunger-related causes rather than bombardment or direct military action. In rural and smaller urban centers throughout occupied Soviet territory, starvation and starvation-related diseases, particularly dysentery, pneumonia, and typhus, killed populations on a scale that remains incompletely documented. Contemporary Soviet estimates, based on census data and demographic analysis, calculated that the Soviet Union suffered approximately 27 million deaths during the entire war, with a significant portion of these in occupied territories being attributable directly or indirectly to starvation policies. Jewish populations confined in ghettos under German occupation experienced systematic starvation. In the Warsaw Ghetto, approximately 420,000 people were confined in an area of roughly 1.3 square kilometers. Starvation rations, combined with disease spread through overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, produced mortality rates that climbed to several thousand per month by 1942. Approximately 100,000 people died in the Warsaw Ghetto from starvation and disease before the survivors were deported to extermination camps. The Lodz Ghetto, with a confined population of over 160,000 at its peak, experienced similar starvation-induced mortality, with approximately 45,000 deaths attributed to hunger and related causes before final liquidation. Children were particularly vulnerable to the consequences of starvation. Infants born to malnourished mothers experienced elevated mortality rates. Children in the age ranges most dependent on food distributions suffered the highest mortality from starvation itself and from infectious diseases that spread rapidly through undernourished populations. The psychological trauma of hunger, witnessed by children during critical developmental periods, left lasting effects on survivors. Accounts from those who experienced childhood starvation during the occupation describe behavior patterns: extreme food-related anxiety, compulsive eating when food became available, difficulty trusting in food security, that persisted for decades after the war's conclusion. The strategic failure and its consequences. The starvation strategy, despite its devastating human toll, ultimately failed in its military and strategic objectives. The expectation was that deliberate deprivation would weaken Soviet resistance, undermine population morale, and facilitate German conquest and consolidation of occupied territories. Instead, the policy produced consequences that undermined German strategic interests and contributed directly to Germany's ultimate defeat. The most immediate failure was logistical. The starvation strategy was premised on the assumption that rapid military victory would eliminate the need for prolonged occupation and food distribution. Operation Barbarossa was intended to be a swift campaign ending in Soviet surrender or collapse within months. Soviet forces, it was assumed, would be defeated in the first campaigns of 1941, and the occupation would be brief. When Soviet forces continued to resist, reorganized, and mounted counteroffensives despite the severe initial defeats they suffered, the calculus shifted. Occupation became indefinite, extending into 1942, 1943, and beyond. A starvation strategy designed for short-term occupation became the management policy for long-term control of vast territories. The infrastructure of extraction that had seemed efficient for obtaining resources from a temporary occupation became increasingly destructive and counterproductive as occupation persisted. Agricultural production in occupied territories declined catastrophically. The requisition of seed grain meant that spring planting was impossible. The conscription of farm labor and horses for military purposes removed the capacity to work the land. The requisition of livestock removed both productive capacity and food sources. German authorities, observing these declines, responded by increasing extraction quotas to compensate for declining production, a policy that further accelerated agricultural collapse. Territories that had been food surplus areas became deficit regions unable to feed their populations through any mechanism. The long-term consequence was that occupied territories, rather than becoming net food producers supporting the German war effort, became increasingly unable to provide either food supplies or goods useful to the occupation authorities. The psychological impact on Soviet populations proved far different from what German planners anticipated. Rather than breaking morale and inducing surrender, starvation hardened resistance and transformed the conflict into a struggle perceived as existential. Soviet soldiers fighting in Red Army units knew what had been done to their families and their lands during German occupation. Accounts of starvation conditions in occupied territories, of requisitions that left civilians to starve, of the systematic extraction of resources spread through the Soviet military and shaped how combatants understood the war. The conflict became not merely a military struggle, but a struggle for survival against an enemy perceived as intent on exterminating the Soviet people and stealing Soviet territory. This perception, grounded in the reality of German occupation policies, created a psychological intensity and determination to resist that exceeded what conventional military defeat alone would have produced. The liberation of occupied territories revealed the full scope of German occupation policies. As Soviet forces advanced westward and reclaimed territory, they encountered devastated landscapes, destroyed infrastructure, and populations bearing the marks of starvation and suffering. The psychological impact on Soviet forces advancing into previously occupied territory was profound. Rather than occupation and starvation breaking Soviet will, the revelation of what had been inflicted on Soviet civilians seemed to deepen commitment to victory and to the punishment of German forces. The Eastern Front evolved into a grinding attrition warfare in which Soviet forces, despite suffering enormous casualties, continued to advance and engage German forces with intensity that exceeded expectations. The starvation strategy, intended to facilitate German victory, instead contributed to the conditions of psychological and material exhaustion that ultimately doomed the German war effort. Long-term medical and demographic consequences. The effects of starvation extended far beyond the immediate death toll and the duration of the war itself. Populations in territories that had experienced German occupation and starvation showed persistent medical and demographic consequences that lasted decades into the post-war period. Survivors of starvation showed reduced physical stature compared to populations that had not experienced famine. Children born in the immediate post-war years to mothers who had survived starvation during occupation showed measurable reductions in birth weight and developmental growth. Medical studies conducted in the 1950s and 1960s on populations from formerly occupied Soviet territories documented stunted growth, increased vulnerability to respiratory and infectious diseases, and reduced life expectancy compared to populations from non-occupied regions. The metabolic damage from severe malnutrition during critical developmental periods proved to be long-lasting and not fully reversible even after the restoration of adequate nutrition. The psychological consequences were equally significant. Survivors of starvation experienced post-traumatic stress symptoms, including nightmares, anxiety, and psychological responses triggered by situations involving food or scarcity. The trauma of watching family members die from starvation, of witnessing the removal of food stores by occupation authorities, of experiencing the slow degradation of the body under severe malnutrition, left psychological marks that did not heal with the passage of time. Some survivors developed eating disorders or compulsive behaviors related to food hoarding and security. Others found normal social engagement difficult, having been traumatized by the dehumanizing conditions of starvation. These effects extended into subsequent generations. Children born after the war to parents who had survived starvation sometimes inherited parental anxiety about food security. The psychological trauma of occupation and starvation was transmitted through families and communities, shaping cultural attitudes toward food, toward authority, and toward the state. The demographic consequences were visible in population statistics from formerly occupied regions, which showed reduced birth rates, increased infant mortality in the immediate post-war years, and population structures distorted by the excess deaths that had occurred during occupation. Documentation, trial, and historical reckoning. In the post-war period, the starvation policy became part of the historical and legal record. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings examined the orders, policies, and decisions that had led to mass starvation. Surviving Nazi administrators and officers were interrogated about the starvation strategy, and many provided testimony that documented the deliberate nature of the policy. The documentation, the planning memoranda, the requisition quotas, The officer reports, the correspondence between administrative levels, provided irrefutable evidence that starvation was not an unfortunate side effect of military operations, but the systematic implementation of Nazi policy. Soviet authorities, conducting their own investigations and trials of Nazi officers and collaborators, accumulated further evidence of the starvation strategy. Interrogation protocols documented how officers at every level understood that their requisition policies would produce starvation. Witness testimony from survivors described the mechanisms through which food was extracted and populations left to starve. The combination of documentary evidence and testimony created a comprehensive historical record of the starvation policy. Historians analyzing the Eastern Front in subsequent decades examined the starvation strategy in detail. Research into Nazi planning documents, occupation authority records, and Soviet archival materials clarified the extent to which starvation was integral to Nazi strategy rather than incidental to it. The starvation policy was revealed not as the unfortunate consequence of a military campaign conducted under resource constraints, but as the deliberate implementation of an ideologically motivated strategy to eliminate Soviet populations and clear territory for German settlement. Historical significance and broader patterns. The starvation of Soviet populations under German occupation stands as one of the largest instances of systematic deprivation and mass death in modern history. The scale, millions of deaths, the deliberateness, documented in planning memoranda and implemented through administrative structures, and the integration into broader genocidal objectives make it a central element of the Holocaust and of Nazi genocide more broadly. The history illuminates how industrial societies can systematize deprivation and mass death. The transformation of logistics, transportation networks, food distribution systems, administrative hierarchies, from mechanisms that normally sustain human life into mechanisms that enforce death, demonstrates how the infrastructure of a modern state can be repurposed for mass killing. The starvation strategy shows how economic calculations and bureaucratic language can obscure mass suffering, how compartmentalized responsibility structures allow systemic harm while distributing responsibility in ways that make individual accountability difficult, and how ideological commitment to a vision of racial reorganization can override humanitarian considerations at every level of decision-making and implementation. The fact that this starvation strategy ultimately failed in its strategic objectives does not diminish its historical significance or moral weight. Millions died before the policy's failure became apparent. The suffering inflicted was real and complete regardless of whether it achieved the strategic aims for which it was designed. The history of the starvation of Soviet populations remains a testimony to what societies are capable of doing when ideological commitment, administrative capacity, and strategic calculation converge to override ordinary moral constraints on state action.